to the Ukraine war now, and Russia's confirmed that a Ukrainian airstrike has hit one of its warships in the Black Sea.
Well, one person's been killed and two injured, with the head of the Ukrainian Air Force claiming the ship had been destroyed. Joining us now is Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham, Scott Lucas. Scott, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What more can you tell us?
Well, the Russian landing ship, Novocherkassk, is destroyed. That's not just a Ukrainian claim. We have visual evidence, both video and photographs, that it was hit by a Ukrainian guided missile early on Tuesday in the port of Feodosiya in occupied Crimea. It is still above the waterline, or at least what remains of the ship is above the waterline, but there's no way it can be put back into service. Significantly, this is the third major landing ship that the Russians have lost since the summer. They have also lost other warships, and even their Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol has been hit by Ukraine. It means, if you want the big picture here, that Ukraine is turning the tide in the war for control of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, which includes, of course, being able to get their grain out to global markets.
So, Scott, just touching on Sevastopol there, as I understand it, that's the only deep water port. Can you just explain to our viewers how important that is for Russia?
When the whole point about a deep water port, if you think about it in the simplest terms, is, of course, you can put your largest ships there. So you can put, for example, the ships that try to enforce the control of all of the Black Sea, the cruisers, the destroyers, the frigates. You can try to blockade Ukraine from being able to move either with its military ships or its ships that carry grain and other exports. Now, if Sevastopol is lost, or if there aren't ships there to be able to use Sevastopol, then you lose that ability. But there's a second effect when you don't have a deep water port. If you don't have a deep water port, you can't move in the large landing ships, which means that you can't move in the Russian troops, you can't move in the armor, you can't move in the heavy weapons that you need, not only to try to keep Vladimir Putin's invasion going, but to try to defend what Russia occupies right now in southern Ukraine and, of course, Crimea itself.
And Scott, obviously, global attention has been focused away from this conflict, and all eyes have been on the Middle East in the last few weeks. As we come forward to the next year, can you give us your predictions of what will happen in this conflict? So obviously, we've talked about the battle on the water. What about the land battles and the air battles?
Yeah, I think with respect, making predictions gets us into a lot of trouble. I think part of the media not understanding what's happening now is that they expected Ukraine's counteroffensive in June to end this war by the end of the year. They predicted it. In fact, as President Zelensky said, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So Ukraine continues to make gradual gains in the east and in the south of the country. But this is something which is going to go well into 2024, possibly 2025. The fundamentals remain, though. If I was to talk to you back, almost 2 years ago, we expected Kyiv to have been overrun within days by Russia. We would have expected a puppet government to be put in place. Not only does Kyiv still stand and the government still stand, Ukraine has regained more than half the territory that it lost to the Russians since 2022. So if Ukraine can maintain international support, which includes providing weapons, providing the air power that it needs for the first time to counter the Russians, it has a very, very good chance of continuing to advance in this war. But Vladimir Putin's hope is he can break international support for Ukraine, not through the battlefield, not through his energy war, not through his war on food, but through his disinformation and propaganda, which says wrongly and falsely that this is a stalemate.
And Scott, that's a really interesting point, trying to keep this conflict in the headlines. Of course, we saw just before Christmas Vladimir Zelensky going to the United States, but actually there was barely any coverage of that visit and his meeting with the president, certainly in the States and the rest of the world. How damaging do you think that is?
Well, there was a good deal of coverage, but the problem is you have a lot of white noise around it, which is that the Republicans in Congress are blockading further aid for Ukraine right now, in part because of a very hard right Republican and Trumpist group in the House that effectively is blackmailing, but also because mainstream Republicans are saying, unless you give us very, very draconian border measures, we won't give you any Ukrainian aid. That's what's dominating the coverage now rather than what actually is happening in Ukraine. I think if we get an agreement in January, a compromise which provides for some border measures and renews the aid to Ukraine, then you've got the U.S. back on course to rejoin most of the international community, including the UK and Europe, in providing Ukraine with the necessary economic and financial as well as military support.
So, Scott, we're looking at the 12th package of sanctions coming up against Russia, but Russian imports of microelectronics, satellite navigation systems, these are now pretty much back at pre-war levels. Are we not just repeating the same actions again and again, but not actually getting proper results?
Again, there's sort of a misnomer from the earliest days of Vladimir Putin's invasion that sanctions were there to break Russia. They weren't. Sanctions weren't going to break what is still a fairly large economy and one which has a number of ways to circumvent those sanctions, as you noticed. They were there to limit Russia's capacity to wage war. So although Russia is getting some microelectronics, although it's getting some technology, it cannot replace what it had before February 2022 fully. That has restricted its military in key ways, and it's also meant that its consumer economy is one which is suffering. Right now, the way that it's suffering mostly is by inflation. You now have inflation which is running at 40–50% on key food products, which is resulting in shortages, such as, for example, the basics like eggs. Now, this is the type of headline that isn't reported in the West, but one of the biggest challenges that Vladimir Putin received a few weeks ago in his very stage-managed press conference was from a pensioner who said, "What about the eggs? Give us the eggs." Putin, of course, tried to blame others in the Kremlin for not handling the situation properly, but it does show that Russia's wartime economy is one which, while it's holding together, is certainly one which is not flourishing, despite some headlines to the contrary.
All right, thank you, Scott Lucas.